Hello and welcome. So today I am going to share my favorite books from 2022. So what I've done is tried to categorize books that really left an impact on me that I want the world to know about. So I'm not the best at the star rating of like, what's a 5-star rating or 4 or 3, 2, 1? What does that actually mean? And I've also realized that my gut instinct reaction sometimes on what a book should be rated, after a while, as I've had time to kind of simmer in it and think about it, sometimes that book rating will go up or down. So it is nice to kind of have the year to look over and see what are the books when I read the title, I am transported back to that time period when I read it, and I can really kind of feel myself still riveted on that tale. And so those are the books that I want to share. I, of course, have some honorable mentions as well, and I actually don't have an official count. Maybe by the end of this we'll come up with a number, but for now, I'm just going to kind of go through the categories and share what did I really love. So the other thing that I wanted to share is how I track my books. So if you've watched my channel, you know that I have a reading journal in which I kind of track everything. I actually, for this year, took that reading journal information and put it into an Excel format and was able to kind of parse out how many books in each category that I've read and the genres that I really gravitated towards, and whether I read mostly adult or young adult or middle grade or kind of maybe where it was even. And I'm really glad that I did that because I actually surprised myself on my favorite genre. I would have thought that I read more young adult novels than I actually did. And so as I am sharing my favorite books, I will also share a little bit of the data about those genres. So the first genre that I'm going to share about is nonfiction. This is a category that I don't read a lot in. One of the nonfictions that I read this year really stood out, and that is 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. So the premise here is that Helene Hanff is an author extraordinaire, and she lives in New York and has discovered that there is a book that she wants that is in London. And so she mails a letter and payment asking for them to please send her this book as a book order. And so this really small bookshop in London that receives her letter, they end up writing back, and what follows is this years-long exchange of correspondence between Helene and bookstore staff in London. And they are exchanging payments and books as well as life that is recorded in these letters. Helene is hilarious, and the family of characters that she corresponds with are quirky and entertaining, and you just really get a feel for the differences between a quirky author in New York and staff at a bookshop across the pond. So you should pick this up if you like epistolary novels that are humorous. I really did laugh out loud when I read this book. It does contain consequences of war, so just be aware of that. So the next smaller category is actually classics, which is surprising because I, until recently, had mostly classics in my repertoire and on my bookshelves. But I really branched out over the last couple of years, and it really was apparent this year when I did the data analysis. Okay, my favorite classic novel that I read in 2022 was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. This was published in 1848. Helen Graham arrives at Wildfell Hall in a cloud of mystery, and through her friendship with a neighbor, Gilbert Markham, her intriguing past slowly comes to light for us. While Helen is intentionally secretive about her past, she eventually decides to share her journal with Gilbert to enlighten him of her past. With this novel, Anne Bronte clearly pushed the social norms. She's got Helen, who is staying alone at Wildfell Hall with her son and a servant, Rachel. Helen is trying to earn a living through art, and she is not actively seeking a husband. This departure from the Bronte novels and some exposure to what it is like to live with an alcoholic is one of the reasons that this book was not published for decades after its first release, and it's only now being republished, and I just really enjoyed reading it. So I would suggest that you read this if you like a bit of a mystery that kind of slowly unravels, as well as redemption. It does contain domestic and emotional abuse, alcoholism, child abuse, child custody, infidelity, and really touched on, what are even hot topics for today, let alone in the mid-1800s that it was originally published in. So the next genre of books that I read the most of were graphic novels. So again, a bit of a departure for me. I definitely branched out in reading a more broad variety of them. And so two that I wanted to highlight that were my favorites. The first one I've talked a lot about on this channel, and that is the Lightfall series by Tim Probst. The first one was published in 2020, and then he published a second one in 2022. So Bee is the adopted granddaughter of the pig wizard on planet Urpa. And the artwork in this book is phenomenal. And walking through the forests of Urpa with Bee is just a magical experience. Through that walk, Bee meets a cat who is now a Galdurian. And that is a race of creatures on Urpa that were previously thought to be extinct, but lo and behold, Bee meets Cad, and the rest is history. So together they discover that Bee's adopted grandfather is missing, and that there is an ancient danger to Urpa that has awoken. And so I would suggest you read this if you like stunning illustrations and quest and fantasy and peril, and it's just lovely. My two kids love it, so I think it is appropriate for your upper elementary and early middle grade. And just be aware though that it does contain violence. The favorite graphic novel that I read in 2022 is When Stars Are Scattered by Omar Mohammed. It was illustrated by Victoria Jameson, who is an award-winning graphic novel artist. This was published in 2020, and Omar and his younger brother Hassan are orphans who live in a refugee camp in Kenya. And Hassan has an intellectual disability and is nonverbal, but he has medical needs that cannot be met in this refugee camp. And so the beauty of this graphic novel is that it is a true story of one brother who sacrifices everything for his love of his little brother. So I would suggest you read this if you enjoy memoir graphic novels and want to really get a feel for what it's like in refugee camp and the decisions that children are having to make. It does obviously contain war and poverty and refugee life. So, but again, it is appropriate, in my opinion, for a middle grade book, and by far my favorite graphic novel of the year. So since we're in middle grade, this is actually the next category of books, largest category of books that I read. And so one honorable mention that I could not do this video without talking about is The Nowhere Emporium by Ross Mackenzie. This was published in 2015. And it is about Daniel, who is an orphan in Glasgow, Scotland. He opens the door to this quirky storefront in a moment of intense need as he's being chased by orphanage bullies. And he's treated kindly by this store proprietor, and then he's kind of ushered back out into the Glasgow streets. But the next day, he returns to the same storefront. And when he enters, the proprietor is like shocked that Daniel remembers him and the store, because apparently no one can ever remember being in the Nowhere Emporium once they leave, but Daniel did. And so the proprietor, who Daniel learns is named Mr. Silver, decides to take Daniel on as an apprentice. With that, little do they know, their relationship is what the Emporium will need if it's going to survive an impending attack. And so I would suggest you read this if you like the Night Circus. It just really had Night Circus vibes, but of course in a middle grade level. And just realize that there is like, it's very intense peril and violence as well. So the next middle grade book that I wanted to share, which is one of my top two, and that is Out of My Mind by Sharon Draper. This was published in 2010. The sequel, Out of My Heart, is also really great, but this is the story of Melody, who is a brilliant young lady. She has incredible memory and recall. She also has cerebral palsy and is not able to talk or walk. The reader is given the perspective of Melody's thoughts as she maneuvers through her diagnoses, school, and even a tragedy. I loved this book so much, and I would suggest that you read this if you liked books like Wonder by R.J. Palacio. This, in my opinion, is a more gentle toe dive into ableism and just a really beautiful book and series, honestly. Just realize that it does contain sibling injury and, as I mentioned, ableism. So my favorite middle grade book that I read this year is this little thin book called Skunk and Badger. It is by Amy Timberlake. It was published in 2020. It's one of those books very similar to The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse, I think is what that's called, where it has these very kind of rudimentary dialogue, but the underlying themes are they just pack a punch. And so this is the story of Badger, who is completely content living in his aunt's house while she's gone. So he lives there, she's off gallivanting in the world, and he is very content. He has his important rock work that he does. He keeps the house spotless. He resolutely relies on his routine until the day he hears a knock on the front door, and he opens it to find Skunk moving in as a roommate based on Badger's aunt's invitation. And then the chickens move in too. And Badger and Skunk have so much to learn about self and each other and compromise and discrimination. It was just my favorite middle grade that I read. And again, so thin and kind of seemingly simple. But again, as I looked over the year and I looked at all the middle grade books that I read, that was the one that I was like, this was such a great book. And so this is kind of like Frog and Toad meets The Odd Couple meets The Wind in the Willows kind of a theme. Does contain discrimination, as I mentioned, so a theme for you to discuss with your kids if you choose to read it. So the next category of books that I read was historical fiction. And that's not much of a surprise. I love historical fiction. So I wasn't surprised to see it be such a large amount of books that I read in 2022. So the first one I wanted to mention as an honorable mention is The Winter Palace by Ava Stachniak. This was published in 2012, and it is about Varvara, who is a bookbinder turned servant turned spy master in Catherine the Great's court. And Varvara develops this tenuous trust with wily Sophie, who is a young princess who is destined to marry the nephew of the empress. Varvara clandestinely winds her way through secret alliances and gives insight into a shadowy, behind-the-curtain view of Russian royalty and court during the 1700s. As a well-researched historical fiction, this novel does not solely focus on Catherine herself, but rather on the complexities within the court itself. And this is not a dry historical account as the reader kind of roils around in the turbulence of the intense drama and seduction and shocking decisions. So it's one of those books where it's like, you should read this if you liked the Downton Abbey upstairs, downstairs viewpoint. Just be aware that it contains intimate details that are shared in like an open door manner. It's not super spicy, but it's fairly explicit. And then infidelity as well. One of my top two favorite historical fictions for 2022 was The Personal Librarian. This was written by Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray, and it was published in 2021. As a burgeoning young adult, Belle Marion Greener decides that she is going to pass as white based on her light complexion. By claiming Portuguese lineage and hiding her Black father's side of the family, she becomes Belle da Costa Green. Her education, experience, networking skills, all of this and passing white lead up to JP Morgan hiring her at a fairly young age, a really young age, to be the curator of his Pierpont Morgan library, which consisted of rare and antiquated books and artwork. And she keeps a really tight rein on herself for most of her life due to this secret of her race. And incredibly, her truth did not come into public knowledge until after her death. She really kept that secret tight her whole life. I listened to the audiobook and it was phenomenal to be pulled along with Belle during this fascinating early adulthood part of her life. So I suggest you read this if you like this kind of dramatized biography of what I would consider a fairly little known but incredibly interesting person. Do be aware that it does contain intimate relationships outside of marriage and also abortion. So, my favorite historical fiction of 2022 is The Last Bookshop of London, written by Madeline Martin, and this was published in 2021. This wholesome account unpacks the story of Grace Bennet, who fortuitously ended up employed at Primrose Hill, which was this quirky, disorganized, kind of like dusty, dark bookshop in London. And during the Blitz of World War II, Grace was able to give hope to the people in her community. There are quite a few side characters surrounding Grace, so it's like her landlady and his son, her best friend, the bookshop owner, other bookshop owners in the area, the children in her community, and then a man whose minimal presence gives Grace a small romantic dalliance through the novel. Again, I listened to this, the audio version was lovely, and the goodness that seeps out of this war story does not really feel overly saccharine to me, especially as the horrors of war are recounted. But rather there's like this genuine innocence that is portrayed that feels a lot like hope. So I would suggest that you read this if you like the Guernsey Literary and Potato Peel Society, but make it innocent. But do be aware that it does contain war and death and the death of close friends. So I parsed out young adult historical fiction that I read. I read some really great ones. Lines of Courage by Jennifer Nielsen was a really great book. But the ones that I wanted to highlight were We Are the Scribes by Randy Pink. This is new release in 2022. I would say it's honorable mention, and I can get into that a little bit. But Ruth Fitz is part of a powerful Black family. She is the daughter of an activist father and the vice presidential candidate mother. When her sister tragically dies, Ruth shuts down and is understandably traumatized. And coincidentally, it is at the same time that she unbelievably starts to receive scrolls from Harriet Jacobs, the author of an autobiography written in 1851 called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Somehow the space-time continuum is breached so that Ruth in modern times can receive scrolls written by Harriet Jacobs from the 19th century. Harriet helps Ruth, who then helps her family through the pain of the loss of her sister and then hope of bringing them out on the other side of this. I would say that you should read this if you enjoyed Octavia Butler's Kindred, especially the graphic novel version, because again, you're moving through that space-time continuum. So there's like this sci-fi feel to it, but it does contain sibling death, parental abandonment, slavery, PTSD, grief, cruelty, and then also swear words. So one of the things I love the most about this is the education that I got on Harriet Jacobs. She legitimately wrote this book in 1861, and she has an account of, so emotional to me, living in an attic crawl space where she could not even stand up for 7 years before eventually, thank God, escaping. Just really awful story about her lack of relationship with her kids during that time because of her hiding up in this attic crawl space. So, but just, I had not known of her, and without this book I would not have. So I really loved that. I loved Ruth as a character and her kind of growth in it. The strange thing is, I can read curse words, but for whatever reason, I went into this book thinking middle grade, even though I think it is targeted specifically to YA. And right off the bat, there's some F-bombs that get dropped, and it just felt really like jarring, right? So sometimes you can read books where there's swear words and it just kind of flows, but that was like the story, and then stop. And it was like, wow, was that necessary? Like, why is that in there? Especially right at the beginning. Again, I think if you kind of got through it and then that was what the language was, you would have come along and been like, yeah, okay, I can understand why somebody would come to that. But it just was jarring at the beginning, which is why I would kind of caution you on it and its honorable mention. So, but my favorite YA historical fiction book is also a new release published in 2022, and that is As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Katu. And what a book this is. So it is definitely YA, and it is set after the revolution in Syria beginning. Salama Kassab is the main character, and she is a hospital volunteer with some medical training from previously being a pharmacy student before the revolution began. Life is now giving her more medical skills experience than pharmaceutical school did, as she goes to the hospital to help her literally war-torn fellow countrymen and women, adults and children. And through her incredible ability to mend injuries, Salama even meets a young man. She develops this chaste affinity for him, but Salama has a secret. Ever since she lost, I'm so emotional today. Ever since she lost everyone in her family due to this war, except her sister-in-law, Layla, she's been plagued by an imaginary visitor, and his name is Khalf. And he's vicious. He's a vicious tormentor who's adamant that Salama needs to take her sister-in-law, Layla, who is pregnant, and leave Syria. The way that internal coping mechanisms to handle grief and horrifying trauma are handled in this book are fascinating to me, as well as heartbreaking. Again, there's a theme with We Are the Scribes where she's dealing with grief through her interaction with the scrolls. Salama is dealing with her grief through interaction with this imaginary character that has spliced kind of out of her. So phenomenal. You should read this if you like modern historical fiction, survivor stories. It is a chaste romance. There is not bad language in it. But it handles war. And so you have to be ready to read about sibling and parental deaths, war, torture, assault, child abuse, food scarcity, PTSD, grief, all of those themes. Okay, so now on to the largest genre of books that I read this year, and that was fantasy. Again, pretty surprising. I mean, I know that I love fantasy, but it was a huge difference. It wasn't just slight. So I had the pleasure of reading Howl's Moving Castle, which is this cult classic from Diane Wynne Jones. You know, obviously it lives up to the adoration of its fans, and but I wanted to kind of choose some books that maybe weren't as well known or were a little bit newer than Howl's Moving Castle. And so the first category that I wanted to share was the adult category. So the first of the two adult fantasies that I would choose as my favorites. The first one is Heart of the Fae by Emma Hand. This was published in 2017. So healer Sorsha makes a deal with Faye that in order to save her family and her people from this like really gross blood beetle plague, which honestly, as I was reading in the beginning about this blood beetle plague, I was like, this might be a DNF because I'm not into gross health things. It's gross, but we got past that and I enjoyed it from there. Through this agreement with the Fae, she travels to the ends of the earth to this like remote hidden island that is home of the banished Fae king named Aemon. And after befriending the pixies and the brownies that also inhabit this island, Sorsha discovers that Aemon has a condition where any injuries that he gets heal up in the form of crystals. And so it like hardens up into this like crystal form. And as Sorsha tries to meet her end of the bargain with Faye to help heal her people with this blood beetle disease, Aemon realizes that his brother, who has taken the throne from him, is destroying the Fae court and the Fae people. This kind of slow burn romance may actually help them both to be able to meet their needs of healing Sorsha's people and also saving Aemon's people. You want to read this if you like Irish folklore and Beauty and the Beast retellings. Aemon is the beast, Sorsha is the beauty, and it is a great retelling, but Fae. I will say it's actually a series. I think you can read the first one and it just ends, but if you're looking for that happily ever after, you are going to need to read the second book. And in my opinion, there's a big shift in the second book, and it is not my favorite of the two books. I loved Heart of the Fae. I will say it does contain drug use and, as I mentioned, gruesome plague details, prostitution. Sorsha, well, she's not a prostitute. That's kind of her home base, is a house of ill repute is kind of where she works in the very beginning. Those are her sisters. There's like wound descriptions, obviously, because of the blood beetle plague and also Aemon's injuries. There's some pretty creepy, unseelie underworld scenes. And there is some spice in this book. It can get pretty detailed with those open door encounters. But again, I actually listened to it on audio and you can kind of skip ahead. So it's not like so much through it that you can't avoid it. My favorite adult fantasy that I read. So this was published in 2020 by V.E. Schwab, who I love as an author. And that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So most people probably know about this, which is so great for V.E. Schwab. But anyway, in the early 1700s in rural France, Addie LaRue makes a Faustian bargain with a god named Luke to save herself from an unwanted marriage. And she ends up with an immortal life in this bargain, but it's one in which no one remembers her from one moment to the next. So Addie lives out centuries of loneliness with only a sometimes annual visit from Luke. Until one day in modern times, a boy named Henry remembers Addie from one day to the next. Aside from the stunning writing, I love V.E.'s writing. One of Addie LaRue's biggest draws to me as a character, she is so adaptable. She learns how to survive and how to have relationships. And this is Addie's story. And this is also Henry's story as well. So I would suggest that you read this if you like a time travel element, consequences of immortality, this unique spin on a Faustian bargain and the relationship between the god-like man and the person who makes the bargain. I will say it does contain open door sexual encounters, assault, depression, suicide, intentionality, as well as arranged marriage, as we talked about in the beginning, and also food scarcity. So lots of themes in this book, but it was my favorite in that category. Okay, so I am ending with young adult fantasy. And so I have So many favorites. Okay, so this one's an honorable mention. It is Twin Crowns by Catherine Doyle and Catherine Weber. This was published in 2022. Wren wakes up and breaks into a castle. Rose wakes up in a desert after never having left her castle. And Wren knows her sister well enough to impersonate her inside the castle walls to the very people who wanted her parents dead. And Rose doesn't know that she has a twin sister and has always trusted and believed the people surrounding her in the castle. And with only a few weeks away from Rose's coronation, it's time for the witch rebels to make their move and replace a princess with one of their own. I have read A Stormkeeper's Island by Catherine Doyle and loved that one as well. This is a YA. It does feel a little middle grade until there are some slightly open door physical encounters. So that would be something to be aware of, that it contains, as well as war and persecution and kidnapping and parental deaths. But I would suggest you read this if you like dual points of view, witches and magic and enemies to lovers trope and uncovering royal intrigue plot. I really liked also the way that the two Catherines kind of wrote the book. They're actually sister-in-laws and just seemed really fun. And the sequel will be on one of my anticipated releases for later on this year. So I had 3 favorite young adult fantasies, and I have them in an order. It might be the order today that they are my favorites, but they're all kind of equal. So the first one is Belladonna by Adeline Grace. This was published in 2022. Signa Farah is an orphan who curses anyone and everyone in her life. And these moments of death of those closest to her, she can physically see Death himself in the room. And as she reaches the ends of her options of people who can care for her, she is brought to Thorngrove, which is the estate of wealthy relatives. And Signa has her own wealth, so that's one of the things that I loved about this book, is that she's not completely reliant on these wealthy family members only for propriety, that she can't live on her own as a young adult, is she having to live with them. So she's got her own wealth, and she enters the house on fairly equal footing, but coupled with being controlled by social norms and her people-pleasing personality, with the propensity of her leaving those around her dead, she's really reticent to make any waves and cause strife. But shortly after she arrives, she discovers there's suspicion surrounding the death of the lady of the house, and she decides to try and solve the mystery. And she finds help in this unlikely character of Death himself. I would say read this if you like a book where you know that 2 characters are meant for each other and aren't really distracted by others. I know some people talk about like not liking the insta romance, but for me, I kind of like not having that tension sometimes where it's like you just know like they're going to be together. I love a happy ending, and so to take that away and be able to focus on a mystery instead is something that I love. It does contain obviously death. There's poisoning and, hence the name Belladonna. And there is slight spice, but not anything that's like graphically open door. So the next book that I loved this year was Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan. This was published, I think, in 2021, and then the sequel, Heart of the Sun Warrior, was published in 2022, so it is a duology. So Shinjin lives on the moon with her goddess mother until the day that she decides to use forbidden magic. And then she is forced to flee the moon and ends up down in the Celestial Kingdom Palace, where she cannot divulge who she is, it's not safe, or from where she came. Shinjin battles discrimination, beasts, betrayal, the magic system, and world building in this sweeping saga that pulls a Chinese legend into the lives of its descendants is phenomenal. The descriptions of food and clothing and palace life alone just glitter with beauty. So I would suggest that you read this if you like Chinese mythology, solid world building, a female warrior main character, and love triangles. It does contain quite a bit of violence, kidnapping, as I mentioned, discrimination. But I was swept up in this. I listened to the audiobook and was just transported. I loved it so much. I actually have also read Heart of the Sun Warrior. They both have places on my shelf. The sequel was really great as well. I still love Daughter of the Moon Goddess best, but how it resolved was really good too. And then the last book that I wanted to mention is the Legendborn series by Tracy Deonn. This was, I think, going to be a duology, but it is now a series, the Legendborn series. The first one was published in 2020, I think, and then the second one, Bloodmarked, came out this past November. So still emotionally destroyed by the death of her mother, Bree sees a flying beast on her first night at UNC Chapel Hill campus. And in a weird exchange with another male student who appears to have like these silver magical abilities, Bree's memories of this event are not erased as he had attempted to do. And now she's like trying to reconcile the life that she thought she knew with the world that she now knows exists. And while the plot of this book is phenomenal and the tie-in with slavery and complex race bias history is magnificent, for me, Bree's character development is the most incredible part of this book. The twists and turns and eventual denouement of this first book, I mean, so intense. It will have the reader rooting for her and her root magic. So I would say read this if you like the King Arthur legend vibes paired with like an Octavia Butler Kindred type vibe. Just really incredible. Loved it so much. It does contain, as I mentioned, parental death and resulting grief, racism, violence, physical and sexual assault, kidnapping. So all of the themes.